Welcome to the podcast. I'm Al Adamsen, and in this episode, I had the great pleasure of speaking with Mercedes Martin. Mercedes has an extraordinary story as she came over from Cuba as a child. Through the course of her experiences, she decided to focus on organizational development and leadership and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her perspective and ideas are unique, and they're uniquely valuable to not only women and women of color, but to those who influence and create the system by which everyone exists. And so, without further ado, here's the discussion with Mercedes Martin and me. Hi, welcome back. I'm here with Mercedes Martin. She is a DEI expert. Mercedes, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Al?
I'm doing real well. I'm very excited to be talking with you today. I mean, not only are you a DEI expert, you're an expert in leadership and understanding organizational culture, inclusion specifically. If you would, please introduce yourself and what we're going to be talking about a little bit today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, first, great to be here and great to be trying out these new questions that I'm asking myself, clients are asking. And yes, in the field of leadership development, but lately, and especially where we find ourselves today, is leadership transformation. So I want to share with you some of the new work that we're exploring, coming through the questions that some of the clients are asking, some of the work that we're doing, and it's all focused on what are some of those key practices when we talk today and say that leaders need to transform. What are some of those key practices and shifts that we're finding are critical and necessary to support them on? So looking forward to jump into this conversation.
Well, likewise, because there's many thought leaders and leaders themselves who are contending that leadership development has to be reinvented, particularly with the pandemic, the continuous disruption, remote work. We can't just press reset on the way we've thought about leadership historically. So yes, I look forward to getting into the details of your thinking and what you advocate be these new approaches. Before we do that, however, I want to understand where your inspirations come from and what has inspired you to get into this field. Now, you're in Florida right now, is that correct?
I am. Well, right now I'm in Miami, and I go between Miami and West Palm Beach. I'm originally from here, so why don't I just jump in and share my story?
Please.
Really, what started and what motivated little Mercedes to to get to where we're at. And I like to start by going back to I was born in Cuba and came to the United States in the early 60s. So that first wave of Cuban refugees that left soon after the revolution. And I start there because that experience of leaving a home country, I was 7, 8 at the time, and growing up in a completely different culture, language, culture, ways of being, and being young, you take a lot of responsibilities, that refugee experience for the family and some of the translation and so forth. So it was a very defining moment in my life. So the refugee experience is one, grew up in Miami, where I sometimes inappropriately call the Cuban Mecca, where every Cuban needs to take a step or go back. And those were very interesting and formative years because, again, being new to the country and refugees, and especially at a time in the early 60s when the civil rights movement was at its peak here in the United States. And we come in and we identify as Black Cubans, but don't speak the language. So that was very confusing for me and my own identity to see other people that had the same skin color as I, but a completely different life experiences, and we couldn't even understand each other. And I think that those experiences, those early experiences, really shape my quest. That is so much part of my work today to really get to the core of what are people's needs whether it's in leadership, whether it's part of the workflow. But most important, are they being seen, heard, and connected? And these days, I talk about those needs and that seen, heard, and connected. And the connected is all the way to the point: are people feeling that they love their work? They feel connected to the point of feeling love at work. So a lot of it, I think, comes from that identity experiences growing up, which I call living on a hyphen. I'm Cuban American, I'm Black and Cuban, I'm a woman. What are all those hyphenated experiences that we have? So definitely a foundation to my work.
And we are hyphenated people in many respects. We're not solely one thing. We're not solely an engineer. We're not solely a Mexican American, Cuban American. We, have a lot of dimensions to us as human beings. And one of the things that I'm really interested to explore with you that in our first discussion we talked about is how are leaders going to acknowledge this multifaceted aspect of who human beings are while still, honoring their humanity, but still, I shouldn't say but, and still getting work done? Because, you can go out and doing it at scale. So it's one thing to, walk around and, have a networking event and spend time getting to know people and, at length and at depth. That's another thing to, hey, we got to get some work done and let's go do it. So, I want to get into your educational background and that frame of reference and how it's influenced you. But before we do that, I just want your take on that dimension of leadership. The idea that we have to balance understanding other people with getting work done. Can you just share your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and that's the major shift, right? And I think that the shift is that we can't continue separating what before we were calling soft skills, the people stuff was separated from getting the work done. And I think that when I talk about these practices and the major shifts, is to understand that taking time to reflect before you start your day, do the mirror work, like we say, of putting that mirror and saying, okay, I'm going into this meeting, it's about X, Y, and Z. What is it? What's the heart of the matter in this conversation? How does it impact what I'm deciding or even thinking about? Is being informed by those lived experiences or even those hyphens. I think that we separate the human experience work from business. And the shift that we're saying, and we're talking about the future, is that that that's that is the work. That the human is the work, and especially the higher you will go up in that organization. Uh, and let me just say this: I get it, and especially with the type of clients. Sometimes it's like, yeah, but I need to get the business done. There's a way that you can do both, and that's why they call practices in a quick way that doesn't take one from the other. So, love.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that because, the idea that we're just going to turn on a switch and all of a sudden be great at it and everyone's going to feel included and belong and all those good stuff is not the right mindset, arguably. And, we do have to practice. We do have to elevate our self-awareness, and how to do that is, something I certainly want to explore with you as we go in the conversation. But before we go there, uh, what did you study, given your experience as a young person coming over from Cuba? When you got into high school, college, what was some of your inspirations, and what did you end up studying to learn more about the human experience, particularly here in America?
It's the first shift in my life where, looking back now, I realized that each shift and landmark in my life came because a good question, provocative question was asked. Either I asked myself or someone. And for me, the education and the direction that I went came about being raised in a very traditional Catholic, Hispanic, Latino Cuban household where gender roles were very, very well defined, and my dad was going to make sure of that. So I went to private all girls high school, Catholic high schools all my life. So you see the gender kind of, it was an era where, especially as Cuban refugees in Miami in that now mid 60s, late 60s, wanted to protect the culture. So by the time I arrived at the University of Miami and I want to study, I applied for pre-med. That's my undergrad. And then after pre-med comes what university I'm going to go to. I'm going to need to leave Miami. And my dad sat me down and made it very clear that no daughter of his was going to leave home, uh, or the only way I would be able to leave home was going to be three conditions. One, I was going to get married, and I would leave with my husband. That was in my interest at the time. Second, that I would join the nunhood. You've met me for a little bit now, and you know that that probably wasn't going to be one of the options. And then the last one was that I would take care of or move in to take care of an elderly family member. And I realized, at that point that I needed to figure out how to navigate the cultural barriers mindsets, right, that I was dealing in the home. And today I think about it this way. Back then it was in a very different, in a very different way. Uh, and what I decided was to join the military. So I switched from pre-med. At the time, the University of Miami had a transcultural nursing program. And what I realized today is that being transcultural, it gave me that, it really tapped into that interest of learning about different cultures, the why that I was always looking for. But I still need to figure out how to leave home and for the family to save face. So I joined the military. I did things backwards. I didn't do ROTC or anything of that. The day of my graduation from the University of Miami with a BSN in transcultural nursing, I came in active duty in the U.S. Air Force, where I served for 12 years and left as a captain. So that really
Wow.
shaped the trajectory of my life. And then the other major change from that question, which for me was, why can't I do this? Why do I see my American born US colleagues women living a completely different lifestyle, making different choices than I can make? What is that about? After
Yeah.
joining the service, my first duty station was in California, where I've been for 30 something years. So you get to see I sometimes I call it, I live multiple realities. I'm moving from Berkeley, Oakland to Miami, and all of that with that start of studying cultures and asking the question, that curiosity of the why is what shaped my education. I went back, I should say, to the University of San Francisco, so now completely different coast. I've been bi-coastal all my life, and that's where I study the organizational development and leadership. Um, at a
Yeah.
time in the early 90s where, and asking that question, everyone directed me to just the beginning of diversity management in the corporate sector. Roosevelt Thomas in Atlanta was just starting with his book, Race and Gender, and the importance. And someone gives it to me to read for a paper, and I said, "Oh, people are consulting on this. This is my life. How do you leave these through these hyphens and experiences?" And that's where I built the work today. A lot of what I
All
do
right.
from that. Yeah.
Wow, it's a fascinating journey. And I'm just going to jump into your military experience because as a woman at that time, and it's obviously a highly structured environment, how did you navigate that? And how did you take that experience from the military and apply it to business and potentially governmental organization, your clients, which might not have that same level of rigor structurally that the military does. What was that transition like?
The structure in the military, I say it saved my life because my archetype is that visionary, big picture, what's next, um, asking the curious questions. And the military gave me the systemic thinking, connecting the dots, which is so much of what I carry in the work today, and especially when I talk about sustainability. How do you look at the whole ecosystem? So the structure, the way to, I fought it. Let's be really honest. I fought it. I was one of those outliers, right? Fighting the structure, but it's also part of the biggest learnings that I have today and that I bring to the client, the process and the strategic thinking approach to what's happening.
And gosh, there's so much that I want to ask about that, and I'm hesitant because uh, I'm bringing in my own biases right now about military
Oh,
and
then let's
what it
go.
might be like
Yes. Yes.
for you in the military. And so, I'm trying to check myself in real time
Go
here,
for it.
but the essence of the question is this: is that of those, my father, former Marine, and I went to officers camp school for the Marine Corps, and so I have some experience with the structure and the idea that your scope of influence is rather small, depending, obviously depending on rank, but the idea that yeah, you see all the dots connected, but to influence the approach to getting a certain objective accomplished requires a lot of influence and collaboration and, for lack of a better term, politicking. Again, that's my bias. And I just want to, I can just imagine you again as a woman, at a leader, at a captain level, trying to get things done and how probably challenging that was for you, but how great of a learning it was to build a coalition to get things done, particularly of diverse people. Is that an accurate portrayal of what your experience was, and would you like to elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. And the joke in the house is that knowing my style and way of being, first, it's a surprise for people that I have a military experience. And second, when I talk about, yes, what I learned from it, what was beneficial was the structure, was also the hardship of figuring out how to navigate a culture, a mindset that was so different from my own, both culturally and personal. Um, that on top of it, at a time when you know I I was I was still active duty when the tailhook, and now I'm going to date myself, incident happened where it really caused a pause in the military. It was Navy, and then it trickled to other branches on sexual harassment that was occurring for women in the military. And then on top of that, for me, and living in all of the hyphens, the intersection of yes, I'm a woman, and also at that a Black woman, and also at that a Latina woman. And I don't name those to play a marginalized or oppression Olympics, but also to highlight the complexity of what I was going through at the time. Examples, some very subtle, others very poignant. One experience was um, my colleague, my NCO, and I being received the award for the outstanding staff. Back then, it was staff development, talent development in our unit, and when the day of the award came. It's a big deal. It was recognized at a national across the services. My commanding officer lets me know that I'm not to, my unit is not recognizing that award because they wanted to give more opportunities to the other women to show up on stage. So that experience of understanding that there's systems and processes, but people can then interpret it, those systems and processes based on their own lenses and experiences, is what later on I realized, and it's the, it's the foundation of the work. I have to tell you that when that happened, people around me were like, "What just happened? How could that be?" And I was one of those who, at the time, felt that very culture again. If I did a great job, put my head down and delivered, that that leader would recognize me, that leader would see, hear, and connect with me. And that was the beginning of the experience that wasn't necessarily so. We had policies and procedures for everything, and there was a subset of policy and procedures that were adapted or applied differently depending where you fell in the organization and how you looked in the organization. And that's true in the military as it is true in private corporate, which is the majority of my work experience. Is that what you were referring to as
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you gave me. By the way, it's not about my expectation. I'm just really, yeah, curious, and that, frankly, not surprising in a very sad, way. Um, it's also the case where I get really hopeful and excited to see things change, however incrementally. And I know just in getting to know you that you have inspired such work, you have inspired such leaders to take different approaches and recognize people when they make key contributions, and even when they're struggling. And I want to get to that notion of practicing and flexing that empathy muscle, and seeing, hearing, and connecting people as you're talking about. uh, I do, though, want to take that military experience and transition to your professional life. So uh, what happened after the Air Force?
well, I another pivotal moment. And before I get to this question, I just wanted uh, to go back to that military experience earlier. And I want to say, Al, that you're right. A lot of what those experiences taught me was to balance the candor with the compassion. So what it did is really clarify. I realized we need to know, I needed to know very clearly, who is Mercedes, and what do I stand for. Now we call it clarity on the purpose and the why. And I think that for many of us, until that's clear, that's where we end up with careers by default, not careers that we really have designed, or conversations or experiences. So I feel like there's a lot to that inner self development. So for me, I went too far from the question, so now I wanted to get back to.
No, no, no. It's just your transition, your transition from military to doing to your professional life in corporate America and elsewhere. Does it, what did that look like? And you mentioned going to USF. Was that when you were still with the Air Force, or was
I was
that
still
when
with
you
the
had
Air
just?
Force, and it came right after I was one of those who left the military and went. I was a full time reservist right before Desert Storm, the first Desert Storm, and I found the one night we got recall. So I had already moved back here. I was going to restart my career military back in Miami. And I got recall and then back to California. It was a big pivotal moment in my life because my son was 3 months and my daughter was 3 years old. And my husband at the time, who's now passed away, was also career military, also nurse. So both of us are active duty now and preparing to deploy. Um, the My son and my daughter, we leave with my parents in Miami. And I saw the decisions that women needed to make. My I also realized, and even now as I'm sharing these stories with you, that so much of my anchor and questions has also been defining what does it mean to be a woman, not only military but in the professional. And I saw the struggle just like we saw with COVID, that women like myself leaving the kids, and there were choices that we made. I understand, but how do you deal with it? So I wanted to explore what was that, what was that like? But there was one defining moment. I was on a night shift. Desert storm. It's in the middle of January. We're waiting to see what's going to happen. All kinds of stories, not unlike what's happening right now with the unfortunate and part of the Ukraine. And what I saw was that we would start a shift. And when I work with the majority of all men, the way in the military you decide who is going to take the lead in that shift, who's going to be the head nurse, by rank. We were doing it in that time like that. And I noticed that when I work with men, it was 5 seconds. Someone would say, okay, let's rock and roll her. Who's going to get us out of here as soon as possible? You're going to rock it and roll it. Okay, Mercedes, you got it. And that was when it was predominantly men. But when I realized when I was working with all women, it would take us sometimes 5-10 minutes to decide who was going to lead for the evening. And it went something like this. When did you pin captain? In May? Oh no, I pinned it in October. So there was this hesitation or discussion about status, and I was like, what is that about? So those two brought me to go back to school, and my study was under healthcare, in nursing, management, and how gender impacted your leadership style. So I'm studying, I'm doing all that. I'm loving it. You picked up by now my rhythm. That is, I get a question, I, you know, find out what people are thinking about it, right? How are they responding? And then I go back to school or get the education and get the rebus. So I am having a great time, and I get a call out. And remember, I'm on military pay. Um, Benefits in the whole bid. And I get a call from IBM at the time. And I don't know if Ted Childs, he was one of the first chief diversity officers at IBM, calls. And they were putting together a women's leadership program, and they couldn't understand. They have invited, it was global, and they invited Brazilians, and they were called women of color. And there was a whole eruption because they were like, we're not women of color. We're not a minority in our country. What is this? This is American terminology that is being applied to us. And I started getting calls like that, still in the military, asking would I facilitate a workshop on what it meant to, culture, especially what it meant to be Black and Latina, what it meant to be a woman identifying as Latina, the refugee, all these hyphens, because there was this realization that, right, that was impacting leadership. That's when the DNI work is starting to formalize. So that's my shift from military. I came home and I said to my family, oh my gosh, I just got a consulting job, and don't laugh at this, $100 an hour. We're going to be so rich. So I transitioned. I left the military and became a consultant at the time. And since the 80s, I come in and out organizations depending on their need, an interesting project, and out to full consulting, which is what I'm doing now with Mercedes Martin and Company. And I'll say this time I came out after almost 10 years with one of the big fours that have had a big impact in my career and the way that I do my work. And it was also because of a question. So that brings us to today. And that question were two questions. I was doing a lot of work in Latin America and bringing the programs, the executive coaching, the leadership development, team acceleration that we were developing here in the US to Latin America, and specifically four countries: Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. And again, my anthropology hat went on because what I noticed was that I had to change so much about the context, about the approach, about what the practices needed to be from what I was bringing to the US, from the US into this country. And one client, internal client, says to me in Brazil, he goes, I'm expecting this to be deep personal work. You're talking about mindset shift. And I just got the request and it's saying that this is a day-long program. Here in Brazil, last time I brought this to my team, just the assessment was 3 days of, 3 hours of asking questions and whatnot. And the process was 3 days. How can we do this in a day? Help me understand. And I said, I get you. And redesign this major shift program, which is, again, the foundation of a lot of what I'm doing today. So the question leads me to my next adventure.
Well, that's fascinating, and thank you for sharing. And that's exactly where I'd like to go, is understanding the work that has evolved, since you left the military, since you were doing this facilitation and experience design for leaders and others. Because there's this idea that I've seen over the past 20 years that diversity, equity, inclusion, organizational culture is a project. It's and specifically DEI leaders were often just solo influencers. They might carry a VP title, but they had limited resources to get things done. Fast forward, they're integral in many organizations to almost everything, call it employee experience or cultural transformation or what have you. But there needs arguably to be an ongoing set of practices or resources that can sustain movement in a positive direction. Is that what I'm hearing that you're doing now, and that where you see the world going is this? Explain to me what it looks like if organizations and specifically leaders are going to develop the muscle of more inclusive behaviors and create cultures that allow people to bring their whole selves to work. What does that look like here in 2022 for you?
Hey, you hit it right on the head. Yes, that's I where I'm at today. I talk about, we need a second generation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to go beyond, is what I say. And I agree with you. The many of the chief diversity, sometimes now I'll call belonging or sustainability officers, are either colleagues or friends that are doing a great job and really bringing in the systemic, outlook to this work. And we're in a completely different era. So before I answer your question on where I'm going in 2022, I think I need to go back because this type of conversation, at least I feel like we need to give it the right context for us to understand where we're at and where we go. And that's the philosophy, right, of my work, that if I look at the past, I could change the future.
Right.
And that's what we call that mirror work for ourselves too. I got in this work. Now I say I'm old. So I started this work with the Coast Cultural right after college, and I finished in the 80s. And I drank the Kool-Aid out. Back then when I came in and then a lot of the diversity training, the context that we use was it's 1986. The Hudson Institute just came out with this future report that says that by the year 2000, we're going to have 85% of the people coming into the workplace are going to be women and people of color. So diversity and inclusion was about creating. Roosevelt had a video, the house for diversity. You're going to now expand to this number of people. And look, the studies show that if you have more diversity, you are going to do better financially. Back then, I don't think we were speaking in the same way about the employee experience or the engagement. We weren't even using inclusion. It was more the diversity, looking at what was different about you. And I was one of those, and many colleagues like Julio Maras and the Juan Lopez, who started the think tanks like Diversity 2000 and now the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, that with that data, we would be able to really anchor the conversation and transform the leadership. So by 2000 comes, and the percentages, the statistics, just like were projected in 1986, were very close or exceeded. But when I stop and not much has changed in the organization, 20 years later, I'm hearing the same type of study issues. I'm changing the name, but the issues remain the same. Groups not feeling, especially marginalized groups, seen, heard, and connected. It comes a time to do things differently. And that's when I say, okay, instead of the system didn't work, and I'm going to believe, I can make provocative statements here. I believe that the system is never going to work. That part of the problem is that we need to regenerate, redesign the system, not fix it. And if that's true, I say, well, then instead of just starting from the system, let me start from the leadership who shapes the system, and how do we change those mindsets. And that's the trajectory, and that's what I see today. It's beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is about the both and, about looking at it as, yes, is about the individual and the identity, the race and ethnicity, but it's also how am I moving everyone in the organization forward. And it's fascinating because what I find, especially in the CEO executive level, when we're doing this work, which by the way, I call them humanity labs, to get in touch again with all of this, that is our, what makes us human, what we're trying to decide here. What I find is that a lot of times there's a lot of hesitation, especially since 2020, to even use the word "this is for all." There's a lot of concern about the backlash, fear and anxiety about the backlash, that if I say this is for all, am I then not supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion? I'm not supporting Black Lives Matters. Am I going to get in one of those social scandals and dilemmas that so many organizations can end up? And I say that is the both and that's been the hardest shift when we come. And now I'm going to take you back. Military models, very yes or no, black and white, the dualistic thinking that many of us are indoctrinated, whether we're aware of not, and especially from a corporate culture, which is military culture, you end up with leaders right now, and you said it earlier, you have to be compassionate, you have to be able to talk about politics, religion, race, ethnicity. um, the Elderman Trust Barometer says that 86% of the population trusts you, the leader of organizations, more than government and whatnot. And oh my gosh, how do I make all of these decisions and not mess up? So there's a lot of that scattered ambiguity that's going on. And the work that we're doing is, that's why Sobre Mesa, let's just put it on the table and figure out what's really going on here, starting with you, and having fun with
Yeah,
it.
God, I love what you're sharing so much, and I imagine our listeners are as well. And it also then invites the question for me is how to create the space to look at the system and acknowledge its weak points, its shortcomings, and have the courage and creativity to actually change it. If I heard you correctly, when you say not fix it, I think about process improvement and putting a Band-Aid on things and just making a modest shift. And when I think of systemic change, I'm thinking about discontinuous innovation and truly doing things differently. So my question again is, how to create the space and have this discussion, this exploration, and make some decisions in the midst of flying the plane to at Mach 2. Life's going on, but we still have to make some shifts. So what does that leadership experience look like to evaluate the system and make appropriate change?
Yeah, yeah. And I love when you bring it back, because that's exactly the concern when I first meet with leaders. When am I going to find the time to do this? And of course, I can give the consulting answer. There is no way that you cannot not make the time. And since 2020, I had to stop and ask myself that question too, because you're right. Everyone is going 100 miles an hour. And what we're talking about, again, is so counter. Um, Two very concrete answers. One is that when I invite them to look at the system, it's their own internal system that they need to start looking at first. And through mindfulness, through understanding your past narrative. So a lot of narrative, story coaching to understand, and all of this is part of the coaching. So very concretely to address that. And I also have to say that another way to contextualize this conversation is that we place organizations in 4 different buckets.
So, sorry, Mercedes. I'm going to be really inappropriate and interrupt you real quick because before you go into those 4, which I know has its own narrative, this mindset and self-reflection and internal narrative. Before we leave that, I have 2 questions, because many business leaders I found are very cognitively centric. They spend a lot of time in their heads. They think about outcomes. They're doers. A lot of, particularly leaders, and I am interested to know from your perspective, have many, they might have read a book or 2, but are they experienced? Because to look at your internal narrative, in my view, is, correct me if I'm wrong, is very experiential. It's tough work. It takes some space. It takes, breathing. It takes, to your point, the mirror, exercise, and doing it repeatedly, not just as a one-off. So the question, how many leaders, maybe on a percentage basis, have actually done that work or are practiced being aware of their internal narrative and the associated biases and opportunities to shift? what's the openness there?
Let me go there and give you the 5, because I see. I was going to, because a lot of how they see themselves or how much they can go to that internal is dependent on where the organization is pulling, where the organization sees itself. So if the organization that they're leading overall, that system is still in, how many women do we have? I can't find any Black people to hire right now. And when do we start a diversity council? That's a very different conversation, or a very different environment for the leader to even find themselves pushing themselves to get to that transformational organization, what we're calling that 4th level, that is really looking at, how do I integrate all of these pieces? How do I integrate the diversity and inclusion with the sustainability, the ESGs, the UN sustainable goals, and realize that I'm managing the whole ecosystem? That's one. The 5 practices for the leaders, and again, it depends on where that organization is at, is not one or the other. There's 5, and what we noticed around 2018, my colleague Liz Guthridge and Miloni Thakar and I interview close to 30 something leaders and ask the question, there's this thing called sustainability, big S sustainability, ESGs, UN, and there's standards in there. There are competencies that relate back to fairness and equity and gender pay. Have you thought of connecting those sustainability goals to your D&I programs and initiatives? And we found, and I'm going to give you that percentage when you say who's looking at mindset and all that. And we found that the majority knew that, yes, that was important to make that connection. I call it connect those dots between sustainability and equity, but they were afraid or didn't feel prepared to address the social sustainability. That's where race, those, right? What we saw, and there was no option in 2020 when what I call the 4 pandemics blew up. Because now you have the environment, you have health, you have race, you have finances, and now you have to address all of those social issues. So what we found was that a lot of times there was a lot of hesitation in making decisions, or generally not knowing how to connect those dots and make decisions, and it was driven from a place of fear of, is this going to impact the organization or not? You saw that when last year, when the voting rights in bills were created in Atlanta, where some organizations were, the CEOs came out and were against it, some of it were with it, and then you also dug deeper and saw that some organizations and leaders were on both sides of that equation. So leaders now need to be able to navigate, right, all of that social scandal, all of that social. What we found was that there was a small cohort, and I'm going to say 7%, and is similar to when you talk about transformative, the archetype of that transformative leader that we need today. All the studies talk about, there's about 7%. They're that Mandela, Nelson Mandela type of archetype that is able to see the collective, is able to move everyone, they're inspirational, and that's what we're talking about. 7%. And there were 5 practices that we noticed that they were engaged in. And the first one is the one I mentioned earlier. It wasn't just that they were doing self-reflection. They're also what Dr. Sean calls, they pivot to mirror work. So they knew that it was the both and. How am I doing with this, as well as what's going? Because if I didn't look at the mirror and clear that spectrum, it was really going to inform what I saw through that lens. The second one that I see in these, cohorts of transformative leaders is that they create these safe and brave places for themselves as well as the organization. So this is where that whole notion of psychological safety, or what Dr. Clark calls a place where vulnerability is rewarded. So you're building teams, you're building the capacity even in yourself to be able to share with full candor and transparency how you're feeling, what you're what you're experiencing, or the decisions that you're making, in order to be able to everyone come. So the safe and brave places for the vulnerability. And the third, there's five of them. The third one is the inclusion piece. And we talk about it from very different ways. And this is part of the new work. So I keep looking for a bigger word than inclusion, but inclusion captures it. And that is, and you said it from the very beginning, they need to do perspective taking. They need to have a full spectrum of lenses to be able to uh, ensure that they have the voice of the organization as well as their own before they make the decision. So, did I consider, and this is where I go back to the people analytics and the data analytics. What is my data saying? But do I also know the stories of what these folks are telling me? Infinite mindset is number 4 that we notice. So they're not, they know this is not a quick fix. They know that this is not a program. They know that this is my colleague says that the word journey is now overused, but this is a long road and a journey, and celebrate those posts. And then the last one is really building the network and the alliances, especially the social networks, to give access. It sounds like I'm adding a lot of time. I'm thrilled to, and we say we're an evidence-based organization, that we do have leadership teams and leaders now that are in that journey of those 5 practices, and you see and are able to measure the change in their perspective, and how they lead. So the time concern that you're bringing up is something that becomes the first awareness or shift for them. That is not so much of the time, but how I'm using the time. And I know that I sound, without the experience, this could sound very. Did she say she was in Berkeley for a while? Because that's what it sounds like right now. And there is actually I'm in a internal MBA program run by the Sounds True, Tammy and the Sounds True Foundation, which is all about realizing that what's going to cause the biggest shift and rewire, and that's why I use those words that are so mechanistic, rewiring of leadership today, is really understanding the internal work and not relying or thinking that we know what those tools need to be or the tools you need to apply, but really creating them. And that's what we're doing in the team setting. 5 practices. The last thing I'll say is the setting is important, and that's the sobremesa. So we host them in beautiful places like a museum, sometimes over a dinner, a meal. Depending on the organization, they bring their leadership team, and some organizations are now looking at cascading it across the and out the organization. And they do serve wine for those that are inclined, nice dinner, and have these real conversations where those 5 practices are discussed, measured, and brought through. So it's a different environment for learning and a different way of introducing it.
Yeah, I want some of that.
Let's do it. And I live in the perfect spot for that too, right?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. Well, we have probably 5-10 more minutes, and there's a lot of places that I can go, and we're definitely going to have to talk some more about this topic, and as well as
love your questions, Al. Yeah.
I mean, it's because your experience, your ideas, your approaches is it's fascinating, and it's called for. It's always been called for, but certainly at this day and age, given everything that's happening in the world, it's yours is an important voice, and the approaches that you take, I hear sustainability, I hear creativity, I hear courage, both self and organizational. So, I certainly celebrate what you're doing. My question, at the individual level, particularly the mirror work, that relates to how in turn you're going to interrelate with other people. So when you talk about ecosystems, connecting DEI to ESG, it is an ecosystem, and there needs arguably different governance across that ecosystem. In other words, we've had silos based on functions. We've had competition for, oh, this is my space, you stay over there, I'll stay over here. The approach to data and analytics has oftentimes been disparate. So my question is, okay, you're going to do a session. Who's in the room? And when we talk about changing the system, are you effectively talking about changing the ongoing governance model, or shifting that as well, and as well as the information that they're absorbing to make better decisions?
Yes. So I definitely want to continue this conversation. So when I talk about the inclusion, another way we talk about that is that we need to move from the tribal and silo to this more collective and community, and that's the eco space. Tribal, when we work with intact teams, and what we call this accelerating the team, we see it. They just think that they're the only ones, right? And then the silo is the function. So now you have a group of teams and the functions, and that keeps replicating. Look, at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that unless we, and my colleague will hate me for saying this, but we got to blow up the way leadership development is being introduced these days. What we're talking about is a completely different context. And at the same time, we're continuing to develop leaders with the same models that we know didn't work. And if I get really provocative, we're writing about the future and where we need to go. Every journal talks about this future direction. And at the same time, we're consulting to the same models that have always been there. So that's the first place where alignment needs to happen. I'm part of LEAP, which is a group, actually UN based, where we're looking at how do we infuse this different mindset in management education and higher education and your MBA programs, so that this dichotomy that we've been working on, this military model of the separation of people, strategy, business, is addressed at that level. I think that the next piece is these environments that we're creating, where it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I need to find out. So really deconstructing what that iconic leadership model, that military officer that has all the answers, that's all the, all of the pieces, is really looked at now as a more collaborative, transformative leader. And that's what's happening in these labs. But what I realize is that it needs to come from the individual. It needs to, there has to be a pull from the leadership, and that's where the 7% comes in.
Yeah.
Well, again, I want to emphasize, I certainly celebrate your work. And I know Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford also aligns with your contention that leadership needs to be reinvented. And it's also the case where it's been more difficult than we care to admit, because yes, there's been this legacy thinking, legacy models mindset. And some of them, they're valuable insofar as they have they reflect where we have been, and can we leverage some of the insights and learn? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean we just go in that same line. What I'm hearing you say is that we have to, again, be more creative and identify the experiences that we want people to have, and then build for that. And particularly given remote work, new technologies, the fact that we're leaving digital footprints all over the place, which provides a, indication of how we're spending our time, who's communicating with who, and we can talk about ethics around that, but that's, a reality. So yeah, I want to celebrate, you, and please keep being your awesome self and doing what you do.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I can't, stop without also mentioning that ditto to everything that you said that we need to look at. And what's different, and we're bringing into the Soda Mesa, is also making it okay to bring some of these indigenous old world practices to support this notion of we need to rewire, I need to think through. And it doesn't have to be with just looking at the past and what didn't work. There's more to it. So I think also expanding that lens on whose definition of leadership are we looking at, to also start from there and make it more inclusive is part of the work, and what I'm excited about and wanting to continue to talk to.
Yeah, as we start to wrap here, I just what you just shared reminded me. Sarta Chawla, who was one of my teachers, talked about shrinking the inner critic and elevating the compassionate witness, and just observing what has happened and looking at it with a caring, compassionate lens. And that's how I see you showing up. And yes, you want to improve things, but you also want to hold people in safety and kindness and without judgment. So that's beautiful. So how can people learn more about you and what you're doing?
LinkedIn. For right now, we're just launching the Sobre Mesa experience, which will be both a podcast and more of a convening Sobre Mesa webinar type function. But the LinkedIn right now, and a lot of what I said today, I will post is actually a presentation dialogue that I do on sustainable equity. That's the framework. And it has a lot of the details and the references there. So I'll post that on my LinkedIn profile.
All right.
Thank you for this conversation and the questions. And
oh, absolutely, it's absolutely my pleasure. I mean, this is thrilling. I'll just say it yet one more time. Your narrative and your ideas, they need to be heard more broadly. It needs to be more widely adopted. And of course, there's others who are doing similar work and want to celebrate them. I just, the idea that leaders have, because they got an MBA or because they've been leaders for 20 years doesn't mean that they're going to be good leaders in 2022 and beyond. The world has shifted, systems have shifted underneath them. So there has to be a greater acknowledgement that there needs to be new ways. And that's what I see you bringing to the fore. So yeah, you keep doing what you do.
Thank you for seeing me and hearing me and connecting.
Absolutely,
it was
Mercede.
a pleasure.
Well, you be well, and look forward
you.
to talking again soon.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening today. If you want to learn more about today's guest, go to pafal.net. You'll be able to see links to the bio as well as to the video of today's program. You'll also have the chance to support this podcast and other shows that we do by becoming a PAFAL community member. You can also donate if you choose. What will be helpful to support PAFAL, the People Data for Good movement, and me will be to share this episode with friends and coworkers and others who might find it valuable. Finally, for updates on upcoming episodes, shows, and events, please subscribe to our newsletter at pafal.net. At the bottom, you can also see our social media presence. So please subscribe to our company page on LinkedIn, follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. We're active as can be, and we want to provide this content to you that is timely, relevant, and actionable. So again, thank you for listening today and hope to see you soon. I also want to give a shout out to Jenna Dern, Malaz El Sheikh, and Sarah Sparnan, who without them, this show would not happen. And now go out and make some great things happen.